Chapter 21 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Chapter 21 Frederick Barbarossa. 69 years old was the red-bearded king, Frederick Barbarossa. He was by right the master of Germany. He had subdued Italy, and had been crowned in the imperial city of Rome. Throughout Europe his name was known and feared. In his own country he was the hero of heroes. He might have ended his days in quiet and peace, but such was not the wish of the iron-hearted warrior. War was his chosen pastime, war was his delight, and the glory of his country was his ambition. From the Holy Land, far over the sea, a call for help was sounded. The Saracens of the desert had captured Jerusalem. They had seized upon the Holy Sepulchre, so dear to every Christian heart. The sacred banner of the cross had been trailed in the dust. Throughout Europe there was great alarm. Devout men went from land to land preaching a crusade for the delivery of the holy places. Christian princes raised mighty armies, and, crossing the seas, fought bravely to drive the unbelieving Saracens back to their native deserts. At such a time could Frederick Barbarossa remain idle at home? Could he rest quietly who had spent 50 years in the turmoil of war? As well could the mountain torrent stand still on the brow of a precipice. He sounded the word of command. He put himself at the head of his armed hosts. He led them forth to the defense of the Holy Land. Neither mountains nor seas, nor sun nor storm delayed his march. And dismay filled the hearts of the Saracens when they heard of his coming. On a day in early spring his army arrived upon the banks of a broad stream in Asia Minor. The land of the Saracens was on the farther side. The banners of the Saracen army were seen in the distance, but the stream was deep and rapid, fed by ice-cold torrents from the melting snows of the mountains. There was neither ferry nor ford, and the soldiers paused, fearing to go forward. Then Frederick rode up and down upon his prancing war steed. 1,000 knights, clad in glittering suits of mail, were behind him. They were the flower of Germany, the bravest and best of the heroes of the Rhineland. The emperor's long beard streamed in the wind like the tail of a flaming red comet. His gleaming sword flashed like lightning as he waved it above his head. His voice was like rolling thunder as he turned in his saddle and called to his eager followers. "Beyond this stream," cried he, "lies the goal towards which we have been pressing. I see the banners of the Saracens upon the hilltops. I hear their cries of defiance. Even now I smell the battle, and see the enemy fleeing before us. Why do we pause here? Let every brave man follow me." He turned his horse quickly and plunged into the stream. His 1,000 mailed knights upon their impatient horses followed him. The roaring waters leaped high to meet them. Horsemen and steeds battled bravely with the flood. They were borne down by the torrent. Their heavy armor dragged them to the bottom. Not one was able to reach the farther shore. Frederick Barbarossa was the last to be overcome. With the strength of a giant he fought his way to the middle of the stream. Then a great wave seized upon him. It hurled him from his steed, and bore him helpless along in the trough of the rushing current. The foot soldiers, watching from the shore, soon lost sight of the hero. The last they saw of him was his red beard streaming far behind, and his glittering sword, which he still held upright. They watched until there was no longer any sign of armored knight or warrior king, for the waters had closed over all. Then, as if moved by a single thought, they cried out in dismay and grief. They wept for their lost leader. They bewailed their own hard fate, thus left without guide or commander in a strange and unfriendly land. Strong men gave way to despair, and brave warriors who feared no danger were overcome with sorrow. As they ran in confusion hither and thither, shrieking and lamenting, a wonderful vision appeared to them. A holy monk, clad in long robes and holding a crucifix in his hand, stood upon the river bank at the spot from which Frederick the hero had leaped into the waves. He beckoned to them to listen. "Why do you weep for your lost leader?" he said. "He is not dead. He has gone back to his own country and yours, to Germany, and with him are his mailed knights. In the Kyffhauser Mountain, in the great hall of the immortals, Frederick Barbarossa rests with his chosen heroes. He will sleep there until the eagles shall cease to fly around the mountain peaks. He will rest there until the time is ripe for the doing of mighty deeds. Then the bell shall toll the hour, the trumpet shall sound, and he will ride forth with his mailed knights to conquer the world. Weep no more, but return to your fatherland, to wait for the day and the hour when your warrior king shall call you." And having spoken these words, the strange monk vanished. "Let us obey him and return to our homes," was the cry. But alas, there were few in that great host who would ever see their fatherland again. Days passed, and years, and circling centuries, but no man knew where to find the hall of the immortals in which Frederick Barbarossa was sleeping with his chosen heroes. When 500 years had gone by, a shepherd chanced one day to wander into a lonely glen far up the side of the Kyffhauser Mountain. A sheep had strayed from the flock, and he had traced it thither, to a part of the mountain which he had never seen before. Suddenly the path which he was following ended. In the rocky wall before him he saw a narrow opening, like a doorway, half hidden by vines and overhanging boughs. Was this a cave, and could the stray sheep have wandered into it? He peered through the doorway. It opened into a long, narrow passage, and beyond the end of the passage the shepherd thought he saw the sunlight glimmering among green trees. "Ah, my stray lamb," he said, "you have found your way to new pastures, I see. I will follow you, and learn what sort of place it is." He went boldly in, thinking that the passage would open out into a sunny glen on the other side of the mountain. The way was long, and for a while he trudged carelessly along, whistling a gay tune. Then he began to sing in clear, joyous tones a little song that he himself had composed. "A throstle in a linden tree sings tira, lira, lira. He sings for you, he sings for me, and he sings tira, lira. All day I watch my lambs and sheep, and whistle tira, lira. 'Tis better far to laugh than weep, so I sing tira, lira. At home my loved ones wait for me, while I sing tira, lira. And when at eve—" The singing stopped suddenly. The shepherd had reached the end of the passage, and the sight which he saw almost caused him to faint. He was standing in the door of a broad hall. the roof of which was upheld by columns of green marble. The walls and the floor were inlaid with sparkling jewels, and it was the light from these, reflected from the green columns, that the shepherd had mistaken for sunlight among green trees. At a marble table in the centre of the hall sat Frederick Barbarossa. His head was resting upon his hands. His face was beaming with the light of other days. His red beard had grown through the table and lay in long, wavy masses upon the floor. Ranged along the wall on either side of the king sat 1,000 mail-clad warriors. Beside them were their arms, glittering bright as on the day when they set out for the Holy Land. The hand of sleep was upon them all. They breathed softly. They dreamed of war and victory. The smile of triumph was on their faces. Long time had they waited there for the word that was to lead them forth. The coming of the shepherd, singing his joyous song, had disturbed the king. Slowly he raised his head. He opened his eyes. He looked around upon his sleeping heroes. Then he cried in tones that echoed through the mountains, "Comrades! Comrades!" The warriors awoke and leaped to their feet. They seized their lances and their swords. Their armor rattled like the sudden bursting of thunder when a storm rages among the hills. A hum of joy ran through the hall. "Do the eagles still circle above the mountain peaks?" asked Barbarossa, raising his sword toward the sparkling roof of the hall. And a voice which seemed far, far away echoed, "The eagles still circle above the mountain peaks." The shadows again settled upon the face of the king. He raised his hand to silence the awakened warriors. "Sleep on, comrades," he said, "the hour has not yet come." With one accord they laid their weapons aside. The light of joy faded from their faces. They sank upon the ground. With closed eyes they slept as soundly as before. The king remained awake for a little while. Then, with a sigh, he again rested his elbows upon the marble table. He leaned his head upon his hand. His fiery beard trailed upon the floor. His face beamed bright as when he was young. He slumbered, waiting for the appointed hour. Strange, weird sounds were heard in the great hall. The wind whistled through the crevices in the rocks. It roared in the dome-shaped roof. It shrieked around the figures of the sleeping warriors. Voices of unseen beings were echoed back and forth, from wall to wall and from column to column. Then soft music filled the air and soothed the slumbering heroes, driving every harsher sound from the enchanted hall. During all this time the shepherd stood entranced, without the power to move or speak. How he escaped from the place he never knew. But when he came to himself he was lying on the grass in the meadow where he was accustomed to keep his flock, and his sheep were quietly feeding around him. End of chapter 21. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 1 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jill Ingle. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Chapter 1. To the littlest teacher of them all and his friends. This book is dedicated with the sincere regards of the author. From Bulletin of the New York Public Library. And last comes the littlest teacher of them all. By standing up very straight, he could look across the top of my desk, and his eyes met mine unwaveringly, as I accused him of having kept Baldwin's 50 Famous Stories from August till December. He explained, and I considered the matter settled. 5 minutes later, I looked up to find him still there. "Little boy, what do you want?" "Please, ma'am, that book." This was too much. "You've had it 3 months. Why don't you take some other?" "Because that's the only one she likes. I've tried another. She won't even look at it." "She? Who is she?" "The one I teach." I thought he was getting mixed. "The book you learn from, little boy?" "No, ma'am, the girl I teach." "How old is she?" He eyed me critically. "'Bout as big as you are." Then he told me all about her. She was the daughter of an Italian shoemender. Her father wasn't very kind to her. She knew no English and had no friends. He taught her in the evenings. But she's learnin', and when she learns, she'll like this better in Italy. To the boys and girls. It is now more than a year since you read my 50 Famous Stories. Those stories, as you will remember, are quite short and easy. Before you had finished your second year at school, you could read every one of them without stopping to study the meaning of the words. Many thousands of children have read those 50 stories, and then they have asked for more. And this is my excuse for the present volume. You are older now, and you have learned many things which you did not know when we first became acquainted. You are able to read almost everything. And so, in telling you 30 more famous stories, I have chosen more difficult subjects, and have not been so careful to select the shortest and easiest words. Still, you will not find this book hard to read. Neither do I think it will prove to be less interesting than the earlier volume. Nearly all the stories are true, and there are not more than 3 or 4 that might not have happened. In every one, there is something worth learning and remembering. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kenneth Thompson Marchese, London. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Chapter 2. Columbus and the Egg. Christopher Columbus discovered America on the 12th of October, 1492. He had spent 18 years in planning for that wonderful first voyage which he made across the Atlantic Ocean. The thoughts and hopes of the best part of his life had been given to it. He had talked and argued with sailors and scholars and princes and kings, saying, "I know that by sailing west across the great ocean, one may at last reach lands that have never been visited by Europeans." But he had been laughed at as a foolish dreamer, and few had any faith in his projects. At last, however, the King and Queen of Spain gave him ships with which to make the trial voyage. He crossed the ocean and discovered strange lands, inhabited by a people unlike any that had been known before. He believed that these lands were a part of India. When he returned home with the news of his discovery, there was great rejoicing, and he was hailed as the hero who had given a new world to Spain. Crowds of people lined the streets through which he passed, and all were anxious to do him honor. The king and queen welcomed him to their palace, and listened with pleasure to the story of his voyage. Never had so great respect been shown to any common man. But there were some who were jealous of the discoverer, and as ready to find fault as others were to praise. "Who is this Columbus?" they asked, "and what has he done? Is he not a pauper pilot from Italy? And could not any other seaman sail across the ocean just as he has done?" One day Columbus was at a dinner which a Spanish gentleman had given in his honor, and several of these persons were present. They were proud, conceited fellows, and they very soon began to try to make Columbus uncomfortable. "You have discovered strange lands beyond the sea," they said, "but what of that? We do not see why there should be so much said about it. Anyone can sail across the ocean, and anybody can coast along the islands on the other side, just as you've done. It is the simplest thing in the world." Columbus made no answer, but after a while he took an egg from a dish and said to the company, "Who among you, gentlemen, can make this egg stand on end?" One by one, those at the table tried the experiment. When the egg had gone entirely around and none had succeeded, all said that it could not be done. Then Columbus took the egg and struck its small end gently upon the table so as to break the shell a little. After that, there was no trouble in making it stand upright. "Gentlemen," said he, "what is easier than to do this which you said was impossible? It is the simplest thing in the world. Anybody can do it, after he has been shown how." End of Chapter 2. Recording by Kenneth Thompson Marchese, London.
Chapter 3 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Farah-Palmer, Sydney. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Upon a Peak in Darien. First story. After Columbus had shown the way to America, a great many Spaniards came over. They came to Haiti and Cuba and Puerto Rico and the smaller islands near them. Like Columbus, they believed that these lands were near the eastern coast of Asia. They believed that they were a part of India, and therefore spoke of them as the Indies. Afterwards, when the mistake became known, these islands were named the West Indies, and the true islands of India were called the East Indies. Far to the southwest of Cuba, Columbus had discovered a long coast which he named Darien. It was the neck of land which we call the Isthmus of Panama, but he supposed that it was a part of the mainland of Asia. A few years later, some Spanish soldiers visited Darien and carried word back to Haiti that there was gold there. Now at that time, a Spaniard would go to the end of the world for gold, and therefore this news caused great excitement among the young men, who had come to cross the ocean for the purpose of adventure. To Darien, was the cry, and soon a company was formed and 2 ships were made ready to sail to that land of promise. The voyage was a delightful one from the start. The sea was calm, the wind was fair, and the vessels sped swiftly on their way. Soon the pleasant shores and green mountains of Haiti were lost to view. Only little rocky islets could be seen. The ship was heading straight into the Caribbean Sea. Then, what was the surprise of the crew of the larger ship to hear strange rappings in the hold? A voice was also heard, like that of someone calling for help. What could it mean? The sailors could not see anyone, and yet the sounds could not be mistaken. "Please, help me out!" The voice seemed to come from among some barrels in which the provisions were stored. "A man is in one of the barrels," said the captain. Soon the barrel was found and opened. Out of it leaped a young man, richly clad in velvet cloak and a silk doublet embroidered with gold. He was a handsome fellow. His eyes were keen and bright, and his face had a determined look, like that of one who is used to having his own way about things. At his side hung a long sword, and in his belt was a dagger. Several of the men knew him, and so he did not need to say that his name was Vasco Núñez de Balboa. They knew that he was a dashing adventurer, always doing and daring, and always borrowing and spending money. But why was he in the barrel? "The truth of the matter is this," he said. "I'm in debt to nearly everybody in Haiti. The officers were looking for me and would have taken me to prison, so I persuaded one of my friends to put me in a barrel and send me on board with the salt beef. And now here I am, bound with the rest of you for the rich coast of Darien." The captain was very angry. He threatened to put Balboa ashore on one of the rocky islets. "Shame, shame!" cried the rest of the party. "Let him go with us. He will be a great help." And so the captain grew kinder and agreed to take him. Balboa's manners were so pleasant, and he proved to be so able and brave, that soon nearly all on the ship looked up to him as their leader. When they reached Darien and began to seek for a good place to settle, Balboa gave them much help. He had been on the coast before, and he guided them to a safe harbour. The captain proved to be so overbearing that the men at last refused to obey him. They chose Balboa to be their commander, and the captain was glad to go back to Haiti in one of the ships. Balboa made a treaty with a powerful Indian chief who lived in a grand house and ruled all the country around. He married the chief's daughter, and at the feast he gave the Spaniards a great quantity of gold, and many slaves. The Indians did not much care for gold. They did not know that it was worth anything. When they saw the Spaniards moulding it into bars and quarrelling over it, they were astonished. "If you think so much of that yellow stuff," they said, "why don't you go where there is plenty of it?" And then they told Balboa that far to the south, on the other side of the mountains, there was a great sea, and on the shores of the sea there lived a people who had so much gold that they used it to make cups and bowls, and even pans and kettles. Balboa made up his mind to go at once in search of that sea. With 200 men and a packet of bloodhounds to chase unfriendly Indians, he set off towards the mountains. The distance was not great, but the country was very rough, the forest was almost impassable, and the party had to move slowly. After many days they came to the highest ridge of the mountains. Balboa climbed to the top of the loftiest peak and looked around. South and west of him he beheld a great sea. It was so near that it seemed almost at his feet, and it stretched away and away into the distance until it seemed to meet the blue sky. No white man had ever beheld that sea before. None had even so much as heard of it. The Spaniards afterwards called it the South Sea, because in going to it across the isthmus it seemed to lie south of the land. But we know it as the largest of all the oceans, the mighty Pacific. From that peak in Darien, Balboa looked down with mingled feelings of awe and exultation. With eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent, upon a peak in Darien. Balboa had no idea that he discovered an ocean. He supposed that the great water was merely a gulf or bay washing the coast, perhaps of India, perhaps of China. He hastened to go down to the shore. He stood on the beach, and as the waves broke about his feet, he raised his sword in the air and declared that he took possession of the new-found sea in the name of the King of Spain. Balboa with his men soon returned to the other side of the isthmus. He sent word to Spain of the discovery he had made. But ships and men and a new governor were already on their way to Darien, for word had reached the king that plenty of gold was to be had there. The new governor was an old man, as fierce and heartless as a tiger. No sooner had he arrived in Darien than he began to oppress and kill the Indians. Thousands of them perished through his cruelty. Balboa was grieved to the heart. He felt pity for the poor savages. By the first homeward-bound ship, he secretly sent complaints to the king about the governor's doings. Then he set to work getting ready to explore the South Sea. 4 more ships were taken apart at Darien, and Balboa caused the pieces to be carried over the mountains. At the shore on the farther side, these pieces were again put together, and the ships were launched upon the sea. They were the first European vessels that ever floated on the Pacific. But they were not yet ready to sail. They still needed a few bolts to strengthen them and some pitch to stop the leaks. While Balboa was waiting for these things, the governor sent for him. The old tiger had heard of the complaints and had been sent to the king. Balboa was ready to obey orders. He recrossed the mountains and was met by the officers who had been sent to arrest him. "You have plotted against me, you have tried to turn the king against me," said the savage governor. "You shall die the death of a traitor." Before the sun went down, the brave, dashing, handsome Balboa was dead. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Adam Farrow Palmer, Sydney. Chapter 4 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Farrow Palmer, Sydney. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Upon a Peak in Darien. Second story. After Balboa's discovery of the Pacific Ocean, 70 years went by. Then, one day, another bold adventurer stood upon a peak in Darien. The name of this man was Francis Drake. He was known far and wide as the most daring sailor on the seas. He was an Englishman, and he hated Spain and the Spaniards with a bitter hatred. Like Balboa, he visited Darien in search of gold, but he meant to get it from those whom he called his enemies, to take it away from them by force. He stood near the top of a high cliff, not far from the line where the famous Panama Canal is now being built. Below him there was a deep ravine, and along the ravine there was a mule path. This mule path was a road along which the Spaniards carried their treasures over the mountains to the seaport of Darien, to be loaded on ships and sent to Spain. Close to this pathway, crouching behind rocks and trees, were Captain Drake's followers, a few rough sailors armed to the teeth and a band of light-footed Indians with spears and clubs. They seemed to be expecting someone to pass that way, for they moved very cautiously and kept their weapons in their hands ready for use, while they watched their leader on the steep mountain wall above them. As Drake stood near the edge of the cliff, he saw before him a tall tree with spreading branches reaching like gaunt, bare arms toward the sky. "Ah," said he, "what better outlook could one want than this?" Sailor as he was, it was easy enough for him to clamber up the gnarled trunk. Soon he was standing on the very topmost branch. As he looked around him, what a glorious view did he behold! On every side were wooded mountain tops, green with tropical verdure. Between them were deep ravines and broad alleys, with thick forests of giant trees and sprawling vines and tangled underwoods, through which the feet of man had never passed. Far to the north he caught faint glimpses of the sea on which he had lately sailed, and he knew that in a snug harbour somewhere on the coast of that sea, his ship, safe hidden from Spanish eyes, was waiting for his return. But it was not for the northern view that he cared. He turned and looked in the other direction. Never had he seen a grander sight. There, in plain view before him, was the great Western Ocean, the mighty Pacific, which the Spaniard Balboa had discovered, and which Spain had ever since claimed as her own. The waters danced and sparkled in the sunlight, just as they had done in Balboa's time, and they stretched south and west a marvellous distance, until at last sea and sky seemed mingled in one. The heart of the bold sailor was strangely moved as he gazed upon this scene, for he was the first of Englishmen to behold that greatest of all waters. As he looked, he could see the ships of Spain, like specks upon the water, sailing into the port of Panama, and bringing the treasures of Peru and of the golden East to swell the wealth and increase the power of the Spanish king. Tears came to his eyes. He clenched his hands with a strong determination. His breath came quickly as he thought of the hated Spaniards and of their claim to the ownership of half the world. Then, forgetting where he was, he knelt down among the branches. "O God," he prayed, "help me to humble the pride of Spain, and help me to promote England's glory on the seas. And I vow to give my time and strength to this cause, and never to rest till I shall sail an English ship on the waters of this great ocean." A call from his men in the ravine below aroused him, and as he hastened to descend from the tree, he heard the tinkle of bells far down the mountain pass. A train of mules laden with gold and silver from the mines of Peru was slowly approaching. It was to waylay and capture such a train that he and his followers had come to this peak in Darien, and here now was his opportunity. An hour later, Captain Drake was dividing the treasure among his followers. There was so great a weight of precious metals that they could not carry it all, but were obliged to bury a part in a secret place in the forest. The story of the bold capture was carried to Panama and the other Spanish towns on the isthmus, but Drake was soon safe back on board his ship. The fear of the bold sea rover spread to every port on the coast, and from that day the pride of Spain began to be humbled. 2 years later, Captain Drake fulfilled his vow by sailing an English vessel on the mighty Pacific. Along the coasts of Chile and Peru he sailed. He captured Spanish towns, he waylaid Spanish treasure ships, he carried terror into all the Spanish provinces. Then, when his vessel was loaded with so much treasure that she could carry no more, he turned his course to the west, and was the first Englishman to sail across the Pacific. Westward and still westward he sailed. He passed on the south of the Philippines, he touched at the Spice Islands, he traversed the Indian Ocean, he sailed around Africa, and he finally returned in safety to England. It was a wonderful voyage, the first English voyage round the world. Queen Elizabeth was so delighted when she heard of Drake's exploits that she cried out, "He shall be Sir Francis Drake. I myself will make him a knight." And Sir Francis Drake it was, and from his time the power of England on the sea began to be felt. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Adam Farrah Palmer, Sydney.
Chapter 5 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Quinlan. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. The Fountain of Youth. Among the Spaniards who flocked to America in the hope of finding gold, there was a certain officer whose name was Juan Ponce de Leon. He had distinguished himself in the Spanish army and was very rich. He also had much influence with the king, so much in fact that he was soon appointed governor of all the eastern part of Haiti. While attending to his duties in Haiti, he learned that at some distance farther eastward there was a rich island abounding in gold and other precious metals. The Indians called this island Borinquen. It was the same land which Columbus had discovered a few years before and called Porto Rico. Ponce de Leon was so much pleased by the reports which were brought to him of the great wealth of Porto Rico that he at once made up his mind to get that wealth for himself. The King of Spain was very willing to please him, and to have a share of the profits, and therefore appointed him governor of Porto Rico. Ponce was not a man to waste time in any undertaking. With 8 stanch ships and several hundred men, he at once set sail for his new province, and in due time landed upon the island. The natives were kind and gentle. They welcomed the white men to their pleasant country and tried to help them in such ways as they could. Ponce de Leon repaid them as the Spaniards at that time usually repaid a kindness. He robbed them of all they had and made slaves of as many as he could. Then, at length, the harassed savages turned against their oppressors and tried to drive them from the island. But what could they do against enemies so cunning and strong? Ponce was as heartless and unfeeling as any wild beast. Soon the once happy island was filled with distress and terror. The Indians were hunted from their homes. Thousands of them were killed, and the rest became the slaves of the conquerors. Ponce began to form a settlement at a place now called Pueblo Viejo, but he soon changed his plans and removed to a fine harbor on the north shore of the island. There he laid out the city of San Juan. He built for himself, near the mouth of the harbor, a grand house which he called Casablanca, or the White Castle, and there he made his home for some time. But with all his wealth, Ponce was not happy. He had lived so carelessly and wildly that his youth went from him early. At 50 years of age, he was a miserable old man. There was no more joy in the world for him. One day, as he was sitting unhappy in the White Castle, a thing occurred that kindled a spark of hope in his despairing mind. He overheard an Indian slave say, "In Bimini, no one grows old." "Bimini? What is Bimini?" he asked. "It is a beautiful island that lies far, far to the north of us," was the answer. "Tell me about it." "There is a fountain there, a spring of clear water, the most wonderful in the world. Every one that bathes in it becomes as young and strong as he was in his best days. No one grows old in Bimini." "Have you ever been there?" "Ah, no. It is too far away for any of our people to make the voyage, but we have heard talk of the fountain all our lives." Ponce asked other Indians about Bimini and its magic fountain. All had heard of it. It was a land fragrant with flowers. It lay far to the northwest, too far for frail canoes to venture. But the great ships of the white men could easily make the voyage in a few days. Ponce made up his mind to discover the fountain. He first got the king's permission to conquer Bimini, wherever it might be. Then, with 3 ships and a number of followers, he sailed toward the northwest. He passed through the great group of islands known as the Bahamas, and wherever there were natives living, he stopped and made inquiries. "Where is Bimini? Where is the magic fountain of youth?" They pointed to the northwest. It was always a little farther and a little farther. No one had ever seen the fountain, but Ponce understood that everyone had heard of it. At length, after leaving the Bahamas far behind them, the Spaniards discovered a strange coast where the land seemed to be covered with flowers. Was this Bimini? Nobody could tell. The coast stretched so far northward and southward that Ponce felt sure it was no island, but the mainland of a continent. The day was Easter Sunday, which in Spain is called Pascua de Flores, or the Feast of Flowers. For this reason, and also because of the abundance of flowers, the Spaniards named the land Florida. Ponce de Leon went on shore at many places and sought for the wonderful fountain. He drank from every clear spring, he bathed in many a limpid stream, but his lost youth did not come back to him. He sailed southward and around to the western coast of Florida, asking everywhere, "Is this Bimini? And where is the fountain of youth?" But the Indians who lived there had never heard of Bimini, and they knew of no fountain of youth. And so, at last, the search was given up, and Ponce returned disappointed to Puerto Rico. 9 years passed, and then he sailed again for Florida. This time he took a number of men with him in order to conquer the country and seize upon whatever treasures he might find there. More than this, he expected to explore its woods and rivers, and seek again for the mysterious fountain of youth. The Florida Indians did not have any treasures, but they were brave and loved their homes. They would not be conquered and enslaved without a struggle. They therefore fell upon the Spaniards when they landed, and drove them back to their ships. Ponce de Leon was struck by an arrow. He was wounded in the thigh. "Take me back to Spain," said he, "for I shall never find the fountain of youth." His ship carried him to Cuba, but no skill could heal his wound. He lingered in pain for a long time, and then died, bewailing his lost youth. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Chapter 6. Eureka. There was once a king of Syracuse whose name was Hiero. The country over which he ruled was quite small, but for that very reason he wanted to wear the biggest crown in the world. So he called in a famous goldsmith who was skillful in all kinds of fine work, and gave him 10 pounds of pure gold. "Take this," he said, "and fashion it into a crown that shall make every other king want it for his own. Be sure that you put into it every grain of the gold I give you, and do not mix any other metal with it." "It shall be as you wish," said the goldsmith. "Here I receive from you 10 pounds of pure gold. Within 90 days I will return to you the finished crown, which shall be of exactly the same weight." 90 days later, true to his word, the goldsmith brought the crown. It was a beautiful piece of work, and all who saw it said that it had not its equal in the world. When King Hiero put it on his head, it felt very uncomfortable. But he did not mind that. He was sure that no other king had so fine a headpiece. After he had admired it from this side and from that, he weighed it on his own scales. It was exactly as heavy as he had ordered. "You deserve great praise," he said to the goldsmith. "You have wrought very skillfully, and you have not lost a grain of my gold." There was in the king's court a very wise man, whose name was Archimedes. When he was called in to admire the king's crown, he turned it over many times and examined it very closely. "Well, what do you think of it?" asked Hiero. "The workmanship is indeed very beautiful," answered Archimedes, but the gold—" "The gold is all there," cried the king. "I weighed it on my own scales." "True," said Archimedes, "but it does not appear to have the same rich red color that it had in the lump. It is not red at all, but a brilliant yellow, as you can plainly see." "Most gold is yellow," said Hiero, "but now that you speak of it, I do remember that when this was in the lump it had a much richer color." "What if the goldsmith has kept out a pound or two of the gold, and made up the weight by adding brass or silver?" asked Archimedes. "Oh, he could not do that," said Hiero. "The gold has merely changed its color in the working." But the more he thought of the matter, the less pleased he was with the crown. At last he said to Archimedes, "Is there any way to find out whether that goldsmith really cheated me, or whether he honestly gave me back my gold?" "I know of no way," was the answer. But Archimedes was not the man to say that anything was impossible. He took great delight in working out hard problems, and when any question puzzled him, he would keep studying until he found some sort of answer to it. And so, day after day, he thought about the gold, and tried to find some way by which it could be tested without doing harm to the crown. One morning he was thinking of this question while he was getting ready for a bath. The great bowl or tub was full to the very edge, and as he stepped into it, a quantity of water flowed out upon the stone floor. A similar thing had happened 100 times before, but this was the first time that Archimedes had thought about it. "How much water did I displace by getting into the tub?" he asked himself. "Anybody can see that I displaced a bulk of water equal to the bulk of my body. A man half my size would displace half as much. Now, suppose instead of putting myself into the tub, I had put Hiero's crown into it. It would have displaced a bulk of water equal to its own bulk. Let me see. Gold is much heavier than silver. 10 pounds of pure gold will not make so great a bulk as, say, 7 pounds of gold mixed with 3 pounds of silver. If Hiero's crown is pure gold, it will displace the same bulk of water as any other 10 pounds of pure gold. But if it is part gold and part silver, it will displace a larger bulk. I have it at last! Eureka! Eureka! Forgetful of everything else, he leaped from the bath. Without stopping to dress himself, he ran through the streets to the king's palace, shouting, "Eureka! Eureka! Eureka!" which in English means, "I have found it! I have found it! I have found it!" The crown was tested. It was found to displace much more water than 10 pounds of pure gold displaced. The guilt of the goldsmith was proved beyond a doubt. But whether he was punished or not, I do not know. Neither does it matter. The simple discovery which Archimedes made in his bathtub was worth far more to the world than Hiero's crown. Can you tell why? End of Chapter 6. Recording by Leonard Wilson.
Chapter 7 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Galileo and the Lamps. In Italy, about 300 years ago, there lived a young man whose name was Galileo. Like Archimedes, he was always thinking and always asking the reasons for things. He invented the thermometer and simple forms of the telescope and the microscope. He made many important discoveries in science. One evening, when he was only 18 years old, he was in the cathedral at Pisa at about the time the lamps were lighted. The lamps, which burned only oil in those days, were hung by long rods from the ceiling. When the lamplighter knocked against them, or the wind blew through the cathedral, they would swing back and forth like pendulums. Galileo noticed this. Then he began to study them more closely. He saw that those which were hung on rods of the same length swung back and forth, or vibrated, in the same length of time. Those that were on the shorter rods vibrated much faster than those on the longer rods. As Galileo watched them swinging to and fro, he became much interested. Millions of people had seen lamps moving in this same way, but not one had ever thought of discovering any useful fact connected with the phenomenon. When Galileo went to his room, he began to experiment. He took a number of cords of different lengths and hung them from the ceiling. To the free end of each cord he fastened a weight. Then he set all to swinging back and forth, like the lamps in the cathedral. Each cord was a pendulum, just as each rod had been. He found after long study that when a cord was 39 1/10 inches long, it vibrated just 60 times in a minute. A cord 1/4 as long vibrated just twice as fast, or once every half second. To vibrate 3 times as fast, or once in every third part of a second, the cord had to be only 1/9 of 39 1/10 inches in length. By experimenting in various ways, Galileo at last discovered how to attach pendulums to timepieces, as we have them now. Thus, to the swinging lamps in the cathedral, and to Galileo's habit of thinking and inquiring, the world owes one of the commonest and most useful of inventions, the pendulum clock. You can make a pendulum for yourself with a cord and a weight of any kind. You can experiment with it if you wish, and perhaps you can find out how long a pendulum must be to vibrate once in 2 seconds. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 8 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Chapter 8. Sir Isaac Newton and the Apple. Sir Isaac Newton was a great thinker. No other man of his time knew so much about the laws of nature. No other man understood the reasons of things so well as he. He learned by looking closely at things and by hard study. He was always thinking. Although he was one of the wisest men that ever lived, yet he felt that he knew but very little. The more he learned, the better he saw how much there was still to be learned. When he was a very old man, he one day said, "I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore. I have amused myself by now and then finding a smooth pebble or a pretty shell, but the great ocean of truth still lies before me, unknown and unexplored." It is only the very ignorant who think themselves very wise. One day in autumn, Sir Isaac was lying on the grass under an apple tree, and thinking. Suddenly an apple that had grown ripe on its branch fell to the ground by his side. "What made that apple fall?" he asked himself. "It fell because its stem would no longer hold it to its branch," was his first thought. But Sir Isaac was not satisfied with this answer. Why did it fall toward the ground? Why should it not fall some other way just as well? He asked. All heavy things fall to the ground. But why do they? Because they are heavy. That is not a good reason, for then we may ask, why is anything heavy? Why is one thing heavier than another? When he had once begun to think about this, he did not stop until he had reasoned it all out. Millions and millions of people had seen apples fall, but it was left for Sir Isaac Newton to ask why they fall. He explained it in this way. Every object draws every other object toward it. The more matter an object contains, the harder it draws. The nearer an object is to another, the harder it draws. The harder an object draws other objects, the heavier it is said to be. The earth is many millions of times heavier than an apple, so it draws the apple toward it millions and millions of times harder than the apple can draw the other way. The earth is millions of times heavier than any object near to or upon its surface, so it draws every such object toward it. This is why things fall, as we say, toward the earth. While we know that every object draws every other object, we cannot know why it does so. We can only give a name to the force that causes this. We call that force gravitation. It is gravitation that causes the apple to fall. It is gravitation that makes things have weight. It is gravitation that keeps all things in their proper places. Suppose there was no such force as gravitation. Would an apple fall to the ground? Suppose that gravitation did not draw objects toward the earth. What would happen? To you who, like Sir Isaac Newton, are always asking why and how, these questions will give something to think about. End of Chapter 8. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.
Chapter 9 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Emily Maynard. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. The First Printer. Part 1. One evening in midsummer, nearly 500 years ago, a stranger arrived in the quaint old town of Haarlem in the Netherlands. The people eyed him curiously as he trudged down the main street, and there were many guesses as to who he might be. A traveler in those days was a rarity in Haarlem, a thing to be looked at and talked about. This traveler was certainly a man of no great consequence. He was dressed poorly, and had neither servant nor horse. He carried his knapsack on his shoulder, and was covered with dust, as though he had walked far. He stopped at a little inn close by the market-place, and asked for lodging. The landlord was pleased with his looks. He was a young man, bright of eye and quick of movement. He might have the best room in the house. "My name," he said, "is John Gutenberg, and my home is in Mainz." "Ah, in Mainz, is it?" exclaimed the landlord. "And pray, why do you leave that place and come to our good Haarlem?" "I am a traveler," answered Gutenberg. "A traveler? And why do you travel?" inquired the landlord. "I am traveling to learn," was the answer. "I am trying to gain knowledge by seeing the world. I have been to Genoa and Venice and Rome." "Ah, have you been so far? Surely you must have seen great things," said the landlord. "Yes," said Gutenberg, "I have walked through Switzerland and Germany, and now I am on my way to France." "How wonderful!" exclaimed the landlord. "And now, while your supper is being cooked, pray tell me, what is the strangest thing you have seen while traveling?" "The strangest thing? Well, I have seen towering mountains and the great sea. I have seen savage beasts and famous men, but nowhere have I seen anything stranger than the ignorance of the common people. Why, they know but little more than their cattle. They know nothing about the country in which they live, and they have scarcely heard of other lands. Indeed, they are ignorant of everything that has happened in the world." "I guess you are right," said the landlord, "but what difference does it make whether they know much or little?" "It makes a great difference," answered Gutenberg. "So long as the common people are thus ignorant, they are made the dupes of the rich and powerful who know more. They are kept poor and degraded in order that their lords and masters may live in wealth and splendor. Now, if there were only some way to make books plentiful and cheap, the poorest man might learn to read and thus gain such knowledge as would help him to better his condition. But as things are, it is only the rich who can buy books. Every volume must be written carefully by hand, and the cost of making it is greater than the earnings of any common man for a lifetime." "Well," said the landlord, "we have a man here in Haarlem who makes books. I don't know how he makes them, but people say that he sells them very cheap. I've heard that he can make as many as 10 in the time it would take a rapid scribe to write one. He calls it printing, I think." "Who is this man? Tell me where I can find him," cried Gutenberg, now much excited. "His name is Lawrence Jansen," answered the landlord. "He has been the coster or sexton of our church for these 40 years, and for that reason everyone calls him Lawrence Coster." "Where does he live? Can I see him?" "Why, the big house that you see just across the marketplace is his. You can find him at home at any time, for since he got into this queer business of making books, he never goes out." Part 2. The young traveler lost no time in making the acquaintance of Lawrence Coster. The old man was delighted to meet with one who was interested in his work. He showed him the books he had printed. He showed him the types and the rude little press that he used. The types were made of pieces of wood that Coster had whittled out with his penknife. "It took a long time to make them," he said, "but see how quickly I can print a page with them." He placed a small sheet of paper upon some types which had been properly arranged. With great care he adjusted them all in his press. Then he threw the weight of his body upon a long lever that operated the crude machine. "See now the printed page," he cried, as he carefully drew the sheet out. "It would have taken hours to write it with a pen. I have printed it in as many minutes." Gutenberg was delighted. "It was by accident that I discovered it," said old Lawrence. "I went out into the woods one afternoon with my grandchildren. There were some beech trees there, and the little fellows wanted me to carve their names on the smooth bark. I did so, for I was always handy with a penknife. Then, while they were running around, I split off some fine pieces of bark and cut the letters of the alphabet upon them, one letter on each piece. I thought they would amuse the baby of the family and perhaps help him to remember his letters. So I wrapped them in a piece of soft paper and carried them home. When I came to undo the package, I was surprised to see the forms of some of the letters distinctly printed on the white paper. It set me to thinking, and at last I thought out this whole plan of printing books." "And a great plan it is," cried Gutenberg. "Ever since I was a boy at school I have been trying to invent some such thing." He asked Lawrence Coster 1,000 questions, and the old man kindly told him all that he knew. "Now indeed knowledge will fly to the ends of the earth," said the delighted young traveler as he hastened back to his inn. He could scarcely wait to be gone. The next morning he was off for Strasbourg. At Strasbourg young Gutenberg shut himself up in a hired room and began to make sets of type like those which Lawrence Coster had shown him. He arranged them in words and sentences. He experimented with them until he was able to print much faster than old Lawrence had done. Finally he tried types of soft metal and found them better than those of wood. He learned to mix ink so it would not spread when pressed by the type. He made brushes and rollers for applying it evenly and smoothly. He improved this thing and that until at last he was able to do that which he had so long desired, make a book so quickly and cheaply that even a poor man could afford to buy it. And thus the art of printing was discovered. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. John Gutenberg and the Voices. One night John Gutenberg worked until very late at his press. He was printing a large folio edition of the Bible in Latin. For weeks he had given all his thoughts to this great work, and now he was completing the last sheets. He was worn out with fatigue, but proud of that which he had accomplished. He leaned his head upon the framework of his press, and gave himself up to thought. Suddenly, from among the types, 2 voices were heard. They were speaking in low but earnest tones, and seemed to be talking about Gutenberg and his invention. "Happy, happy man," said the first voice, which was gentle and sweet and full of encouragement. "Let him go on with the work he has begun. Books will now be plentiful and cheap. The poorest man can buy them. Every child will learn to read. The words of the wise and the good will be printed on thousands of sheets and carried all over the world. They will be read in every household. The age of ignorance will be at an end. Men will learn to think and know and act for themselves. They will no longer be the slaves of kings, and the name of John Gutenberg, inventor of printing, will be remembered to the end of time." Then the other voice spoke. It was a stern, strong voice, although not unpleasant, and it spoke in tones of warning. "Let John Gutenberg beware of what he is doing. His invention will prove to be a curse rather than a blessing. It is true that books will be plentiful and cheap, but they will not all be good books. The words of the vulgar and the vile will also be printed. They will be carried into millions of households to poison the minds of children, and to make men and women doubt the truth and despise virtue. Let John Gutenberg beware lest he be remembered as one who brought evil into the world rather than good. And so the two voices went on, one claiming that the printing press would bless all mankind, the other saying that it would surely prove to be a curse. John Gutenberg felt much distressed. He did not know what to do. He thought of the great harm that might be done through the printing of bad books, how they would corrupt the minds of the innocent, how they would stir up the passions of the wicked. Suddenly he seized a heavy hammer and began to break his press in pieces. "It shall not be said of me that I helped to make the world worse," he cried. But as he was madly destroying that which had cost him so much pains to build, he heard a third voice. It seemed to come from the press itself, and it spoke in tones of sweet persuasion. "Think still again," it said, "and do not act rashly. The best of God's gifts may be abused, and yet they are all good. The art of printing will enlighten the world. Its power for blessing mankind will be 1,000 times greater than its power for doing harm. Hold your hand, John Gutenberg, and remember that you are helping to make men better and not worse." The upraised hammer dropped from his hands. The sound of it striking the floor aroused him. He rubbed his eyes and looked around. He wondered if he had been dreaming. End of Chapter 10. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 11 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Hall. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. James Watt and the Tea Kettle. A little Scotch boy was sitting in his grandmother's kitchen. He was watching the red flames in the wide open fireplace and quietly wondering about the causes of things. Indeed, he was always wondering and always wanting to know. "Grandma," he presently asked, "what makes the fire burn?" This was not the first time he had puzzled his grandmother with questions that she could not answer. So she went on with her preparations for supper and paid no heed to his query. Above the fire, an old-fashioned tea kettle was hanging. The water within it was beginning to bubble. A thin cloud of steam was rising from the spout. Soon the lid began to rattle and shake. The hot vapor puffed out at a furious rate, yet when the lad peeped under the lid, he could see nothing. "Grandma, what is in the tea kettle?" he asked. "Water, my child, nothing but water." "But I know there is something else. There is something in there that lifts the lid and makes it rattle." The grandmother laughed. "Oh, that is only steam," she said. "You can see it coming out of the spout and puffing up under the lid." "But you said there was nothing but water in the kettle. How did the steam get under the lid?" "Why, my dear, it comes out of the hot water. The hot water makes it." The grandmother was beginning to feel puzzled. The lad lifted the lid and peeped inside again. He could see nothing but the bubbling water. The steam was not visible until it was fairly out of the kettle. "How queer," he said. "The steam must be very strong to lift the heavy iron lid. Grandma, how much water did you put in the kettle?" "About a quart, Jamie." "Well, if the steam from so little water is so strong, why would not the steam from a great deal of water be a great deal stronger? Why couldn't it be made to lift a much greater weight? Why couldn't it be made to turn wheels?" The grandmother made no reply. These questions of Jamie's were more puzzling than profitable, she thought. She went about her work silently, and Jamie sat still in his place and studied the tea kettle. How to understand the power that is in steam, and how to make it do other things than rattle the lids of the tea kettles, that was the problem which James Watt, the inquisitive Scotch boy, set himself to solve. Day after day he thought about it, and evening after evening he sat by his grandmother's fireside and watched the thin white vapour come out of the tea kettle and lose itself in the yawning black throat of the chimney. The idea grew with him as he grew into manhood, and by long study he began to reason upon it to some purpose. There is a wonderful power in steam, he said to himself. There was never a giant who had so much strength. If we only knew how to harness that power, there is no end to the things it might do for us. It would not only lift weights, but it would turn all kinds of machinery. It would draw our wagons, it would push our ships, it would plough and sow, it would spin and weave. For thousands of years, men have been working alongside this power, never dreaming that it might be made their servant. But how can this be done? That is the question. He tried one experiment after another. He failed again and again, but from each failure he learned something new. Men laughed at him. How ridiculous, they said, to think that steam can be made to run machinery. But James Watt persevered, and in the end was able to give to the world the first successful form of the steam engine. Thus, from the study of so simple a thing as a common tea kettle, the most useful of all modern inventions was finally produced. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Dr. Johnson and his Father. Scene first. It is in a little bookshop in the city of Lichfield, England. The floor has just been swept and the shutter taken down from one small window. The hour is early, and customers have not yet begun to drop in. Out of doors the rain is falling. At a small table near the door, a feeble, white-haired old man is making up some packages of books. As he arranges them in a large basket, he stops now and then, as though disturbed by pain. He puts his hand to his side. He coughs in a most distressing way. Then he sits down and rests himself, leaning his elbows upon the table. "Samuel," he calls. In the farther corner of the room there is a young man busily reading from a large book that is spread open before him. He is a very odd-looking fellow, perhaps 18 years of age, but you would take him to be older. He is large and awkward, with a great round face, scarred and marked by a strange disease. His eyesight must be poor, for, as he reads, he bends down until his face is quite near the printed page. "Samuel!" again the old man calls. But Samuel makes no reply. He was so deeply interested in his book that he does not hear. The old man rests himself a little longer, and then finishes tying his packages. He lifts the heavy basket and sets it on the table. The exertion brings on another fit of coughing, and when it is over he calls for the third time, "Samuel!" "What is it, father?" This time the call is heard. "You know, Samuel," he says, "that to-morrow is market day at Uttoxeter, and our stall must be attended to. Some of our friends will be there to look at the new books which they expect me to bring. One of us must go down to the stage this morning and get everything in readiness, but I hardly feel able for the journey, My cough troubles me quite a little, and you see that it is raining very hard." "Yes, father, I am sorry," answered Samuel, and his face is again bent over the book. "I thought perhaps you would go down to the market, and that I might stay here at the shop," says his father. But Samuel does not hear. He is deep in the study of some Latin classic. The old man goes to the door and looks out. The rain is still falling. He shivers and buttons his coat. It is a 20-mile ride to Uttoxeter. In 5 minutes the stage will pass the door. "Samuel, will you not go down to the market for me this time?" The old man is putting on his great coat. He is reaching for his hat. The basket is on his arm. He casts a beseeching glance at his son, hoping that he will relent at the last moment. "Here comes the coach, Samuel," and the old man is choked by another fit of coughing. Whether Samuel hears or not, I do not know. He is still reading, and he makes no sign nor motion. The stage comes rattling down the street. The old man with his basket of books staggers out of the door. The stage halts for a moment while he climbs in. Then the driver swings his whip, and all are away. Samuel, in the shop, still bends over his book. Out of doors the rain is falling. Scene second. Just 50 years have passed, and again it is market day in Uttoxeter. The rain is falling in the streets. The people who have wares to sell huddle under the eaves and in the stalls and booths that have roofs over them. A chaise from Lichfield pulls up at the entrance to the market square. An old man alights. One would guess him to be 70 years of age. He is large and not well shaped. His face is seamed and scarred, and he makes strange grimaces as he clambers out of the chaise. He wheezes and puffs as though afflicted with asthma. He walks with the aid of a heavy stick. With slow but ponderous strides he enters the market place and looks around. He seems not to know that the rain is falling. He looks at the little stalls ranged along the walls of the market place. Some have roofs over them and are the centres of noisy trade. Others have fallen into disuse and are empty. The stranger halts before one of the latter. "Yes, this is it," he says. He has a strange habit of talking aloud to himself. "I remember it well. It was here that my father, on certain market days, sold books to the clergy of the county. The good men came from every parish to see his wares and to hear him describe their contents." He turns abruptly around. "Yes, this is the place," he repeats. He stands quite still and upright, directly in front of the little old stall. He takes off his hat and holds it beneath his arm. His great walking stick has fallen into the gutter. He bows his head and clasps his hands. He does not seem to know that the rain is falling. The clock in the tower above the market strikes 11. The passers-by stop and gaze at the stranger. The market people peer at him from their booths and stalls. Some laugh as the rain runs in streams down his scarred old cheeks. Rain, is it? Or can it be tears? Boys hoot at him. Some of the ruder ones even hint at throwing mud, but a sense of shame withholds them from the act. "He is a poor lunatic. Let him alone," say the more compassionate. The rain falls upon his bare head and his broad shoulders. He is drenched and chilled, but he stands motionless and silent, looking neither to the right nor to the left. "Who is that old fool?" asks the thoughtless young man who chances to be passing. "Do you ask who he is?" asks a gentleman from London. "Why, he is Dr. Samuel Johnson, the most famous man in England. It was he who wrote Rasselas and the Lives of the Poets, and Irene, and many another work which all men are praising. It was he who made the great English Dictionary, the most wonderful book of our times. In London, the noblest lords and ladies take pleasure in doing him honour. He is the literary lion of England." "Then why does he come to Uttoxeter, and stand thus in the pouring rain?" I cannot tell you, but doubtless he has reasons for doing so," said the gentleman. And the gentleman passes on. At length there is a lull in the storm. The birds are chirping among the housetops. The people wonder if the rain is over, and venture out into the slippery street. The clock in the tower above the market strikes 12. The renowned stranger has stood a whole hour motionless in the market-place, and again the rain is falling. Slowly now he returns his hat to his head. He finds his walking-stick where it had fallen. He lifts his eyes reverently for a moment, and then, with a lordly, lumbering motion, walks down the street to meet the chaise which is ready to return to Lichfield. We follow him through the pattering rain to his native town. "Why, Dr. Johnson," exclaims his hostess, "we have missed you all day, and you are so wet and chilled. Where have you been?" "Madam," says the great man, "50 years ago, this very day, I tacitly refused to oblige or obey my father. The thought of the pain which I must have caused him has haunted me ever since. To do away the sin of that hour, I this morning went in a chaise to Uttoxeter, and did do penance publicly before the stall which my father had formerly used." The great man bows his head upon his hands and sobs. Out of doors the rain is falling. End of chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Chapter 13, Webster and the Woodchuck. On a farm among the hills of New Hampshire there once lived a little boy whose name was Daniel Webster. He was a tiny fellow for one of his age. His hair was jet black, and his eyes were so dark and wonderful that nobody who once saw them could ever forget them. He was not strong enough to help much on the farm, and so he spent much of his time in playing in the woods and fields. Unlike many farmers' boys, he had a very gentle heart. He loved the trees and flowers and the harmless wild creatures that made their homes among them. But he did not play all the time. Long before he was old enough to go to school, he learned to read, and he read so well that everybody liked to hear him, and never grew tired of listening. The neighbors, when driving past his father's house, would stop their horses and call for Danny Webster to come out and read to them. At that time there were no children's books such as you have now. Indeed, there were but very few books of any kind in the homes of the New Hampshire farmers. But Daniel read such books as he could get, and he read them over and over again till he knew all that was in them. In this way he learned a great deal of the Bible so well that he could repeat verse after verse without making a mistake, and these verses he remembered as long as he lived. Daniel's father was not only a farmer, but he was a judge in the county court. He had a great love for the law, and he hoped that Daniel, when he became a man, would be a lawyer. It happened one summer that a woodchuck made its burrow in the side of a hill near Mr. Webster's house. On warm, dark nights it would come down into the garden and eat the tender leaves of the cabbages and other plants that were growing there. Nobody knew how much harm it might do in the end. Daniel and his elder brother, Ezekiel, made up their minds to catch the little thief. They tried this thing and that, but for a long time he was too cunning for them. Then they built a strong trap where the woodchuck would be sure to walk into it, and the next morning There he was. "We have him at last," cried Ezekiel. "Now, Mr. Woodchuck, you've done mischief enough, and I'm going to kill you." But Daniel pitied the little animal. "No, don't hurt him," he said. "Let us carry him over the hills, far into the woods, and let him go." Ezekiel, however, would not agree to this. His heart was not so tender as his little brother's. He was bent on killing the woodchuck, and laughed at the thought of letting it go. "Let us ask father about it," said Daniel. "All right," said Ezekiel. "I know what the judge will decide." They carried the trap with the woodchuck in it to their father, and asked what they should do. "Well, boys," said Mr. Webster, "we will settle the question in this way. We will hold a court right here. I will be the judge, and you shall be the lawyers. You shall each plead your case, for or against the prisoner, and I will decide what his punishment shall be." Ezekiel, as the prosecutor, made the first speech. He told about the mischief that had been done. He showed that all woodchucks are bad and cannot be trusted. He spoke of the time and labor that had been spent in trying to catch the thief, and declared that if they should now set him free, he would be a worse thief than before. "A woodchuck's skin," he said, "may perhaps be sold for 10 cents. Small as that sum is, it will go a little way toward paying for the cabbage he has eaten. But if we set him free, how shall we ever recover even a penny of what we have lost? Clearly, he is of more value dead than alive, and therefore he ought to be put out of the way at once." Ezekiel's speech was a good one, and it pleased the judge very much. What he said was true and to the point, and it would be hard for Daniel to make any answer to it. Daniel began by pleading for the poor animal's life. He looked up into the judge's face and said, "God made the woodchuck. He made him to live in the bright sunlight and the pure air. He made him to enjoy the free fields and the green woods. The woodchuck has a right to his life, for God gave it to him. God gives us our food. He gives us all that we have. And shall we refuse to share a little of it with this poor dumb creature who has as much right to God's gifts as we have? The woodchuck is not a fierce animal like the wolf or the fox. He lives in quiet and peace. A hole in the side of a hill and a little food is all he wants. He has harmed nothing but a few plants which he ate to keep himself alive. He has a right to life, to food, to liberty, and we have no right to say he shall not have them. Look at his soft, pleading eyes. See him tremble with fear. He cannot speak for himself, and this is the only way in which he can plead for the life that is so sweet to him. Shall we be so cruel as to kill him? Shall we be so selfish as to take from him the life that God gave him?" The judge's eyes were filled with tears as he listened. His heart was stirred. He felt that God had given him a son whose name would some day be known to the world. He did not wait for Daniel to finish his speech. He sprang to his feet, and as he wiped the tear from his eyes, he cried out, "Ezekiel, let the woodchuck go." End of Chapter 13. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.
Chapter 14 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Smith. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Friar Bacon and the Brazen Head. 1. The Wizard. More than 700 years ago there was a professor in the University of Oxford whose name was Roger Bacon. People called him Friar Bacon, for he was a monk, and in those days only monks and priests had anything to do with learning. Friar Bacon was the greatest scholar in all Europe. He knew so much more than his brother professors and monks that some of them said he was a wizard, and got all his learning by the practice of magic. The common people looked upon him with awe, and when they chanced to meet him, or saw him at a distance, they muttered a charm to ward off any evil spell that he might cast upon them. The friar cared but little for all the talk that was going on. He smiled, and continued his studies and experiments just as before. "It makes little difference what they say," he said. One day he made a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulphur, and invited several of the professors to come and look at it. What was their amazement, when he touched it with the smallest spark, to see the whole mixture go up in air with a blinding flash and a fearful roar! It was only gunpowder, but people were then ignorant of that useful and fearful compound, and they would have nothing to do with it for yet 200 years. "We told you so!" shouted the frightened monks as they rushed out of the room. "He is a wizard! No honest man could kindle a blaze so blinding or make a sound so fearful. Why, the very earth trembled, and the smoke was like that from a volcano. If this man is allowed to go on, he will destroy us all." The end of the whole matter was that they put him out of the university, and said that they would have no more of his magical doings, and to make sure that he would let them alone, they locked him up in a narrow cell, and gave him only bread and water, and little enough of that. Some even talked of faggots and fire as the very best things to cure a wizard. But they dared not be too severe with the friar, lest they should displease the Pope. Now the Pope knew Friar Bacon very well. In fact, the two had been students at the same school in Paris when both were young, and they had formed a friendship at that time which was never to be broken. The Pope was a wise and broad-minded man, and he did not object to a little magic of the kind in which Friar Bacon delighted, and when the fame of Bacon's learning came to his ears, he felt himself honoured by being the friend of such a man. The action of the monks and professors at Oxford was anything but pleasing to him. "The foolish fellows!" he exclaimed. "They would punish the wisest man of the age simply because he shows them their own ignorance." And he commanded that the friar should be given his freedom and be permitted to go where he chose. The professors could do nothing but obey. With solemn looks, but with oily words on their tongues, they unbolted the door of the prison cell and bade their prisoner come out and enjoy the sunshine again. "We would not do you any harm for the world," they said, "and to prove our friendship for you, we will pay your expenses to London, or even to Paris, if you wish to go there. The University of Oxford is but a poor place for a man of your talents. Another person has already been chosen to fill your chair." This they said, hoping to get rid of him. 2. The manuscript. Friar Bacon was not ready, however, to go far from Oxford. In the tower of an old monastery near by he found a room which exactly suited his wants, and there he resolved to stay until he had finished some experiments that he wished to try. He had a learned friend, Friar Bungay, who came daily to visit him, and his servant Miles kept the room in order and attended to all his wants. He was happier there, with his books and his instruments and his chemicals, than he could have been in London or in Paris. Every night, until long after the midnight hour, the light of the friar's little lamp could be seen glimmering through the narrow window of his study, and feebly twinkling in the darkness. The country people who saw it at a distance shook their heads, and whispered that the old wizard was busy with his magic again. And then they talked of the fearful things that had been seen and heard around the gloomy old tower. One man who had ventured quite close to it on a dark night had beheld blue flames dancing on the eaves and sheets of fire leaping from the roof. Another had heard dreadful shrieks and a sharp, deafening sounds like thunderclaps issuing from the tower. A third had seen a star shoot from the friar's window and lose itself far up in the sky. Such tales filled many a simple heart with awe. Within his room, surrounded by his books and his instruments, Friar Bacon was content to let the world think of him as it would. One day Friar Bungay brought to him an old Arabic manuscript which some wandering knight had picked up in Spain or perhaps in far-away Palestine. The two friends set to work at once to make out its meaning. It was yellow and creased and covered with many a mysterious sign, but Friar Bacon did not lay it aside until he had read almost every word of it. "It is strange, very strange," said he to Bungay, "but I believe it can be done." "What?" cried Bungay. "Can lifeless brass be made to speak and tell secrets that have been hidden from the wisest of men?" "So says this manuscript," answered Bacon, "and here are careful directions for making an instrument that will give the dead metal a tongue." And he translated them again for his friend. "The thing seems not unreasonable," said Bungay. "Let us try it," said Bacon. 3. The Brazen Head. For 7 years the two monks toiled in secret. Every day the furnace which they had built in the tower glowed with white flame, and from the chimney top such clouds of black smoke issued as caused the hearts of the country folk to beat again with fear. Old kettles and precious plates and ornaments gathered in foreign lands were broken up and melted. The brass hilts of old swords were thrown into the melting pot. Then came days upon days of moulding and shaping and fitting, and at last the eyes of the two friends were gladdened by the sight of the object of all their labor. It was the head of an image of brass, faultlessly made, beautiful in every line, a wonder to look upon. Then began the true work of the magician. The head was fastened upon a pedestal of marble. Clockwork was placed inside of it. Wires were attached to the tongue, the eyeballs, and other parts of the image. These were carried to mysterious jars of chemicals hidden away in a dark closet. Everything was done with care, strictly according to the directions given in the manuscript. When at last the work was ended, the two friars took turns in watching the brazen head day and night. For more than a month there was never a minute that one of them was not sitting before it, and listening for any sound that it might utter. Then, worn out by his watching, Friar Bungay became ill, and Friar Bacon watched alone. But neither friars nor philosophers can live long without sleep, and on the 5th night he was wholly exhausted. "If I can keep awake but 12 hours longer," he muttered, "the wonderful voice will speak and the great secret will be known." But he could not keep awake. His eyes closed in spite of himself. His head sank upon his breast. He fell gently back in his chair, and was asleep. In a moment he roused himself, only to do the same thing again. Over and over this happened, until at last it lacked but 3 hours of midnight. "I can hold out no longer," he sighed. "Ah, if only Friar Bungay could come!" Then a new thought came into his mind. He rang a bell, and in a few minutes the servant Miles came sleepily in, carrying a heavy cudgel. "Miles," said the friar, "will you do me a great favor to-night?" "I will do anything that I can, master," answered Miles, rubbing his eyes, "but I can neither fly nor swim. What is it you would have done?" "Do you see this brazen head?" said the friar, and as he spoke he touched a secret spring which caused sparks of light to flash from the image's eyes. "Oh, master, you know that I see it," said Miles, stepping back in alarm. "Well, then, you must know that for 39 nights Friar Bungay and myself have watched this head. Sooner or later, yes, perhaps even before another morning dawns, its lips will utter a secret of the greatest importance to every Englishman, and sad will it be for us if we fail to hear what is said." "Yes, master," said Miles, trembling as he glanced about the room. "You need not be afraid of the brazen head," said the friar, as he touched another spring. "It may do strange things, but it will harm no man." A sound like roaring thunder filled the room. The image's eyes flashed again, and a cloud of blue smoke came pouring from its nostrils. Miles turned white with fear. and would have run out at the door had not the friar held him by the arm. "Do not be afraid," he said. "The head will not hurt you. It does these things at my bidding. If you do not touch it, it will remain quiet in its place, just as it is now." "I see, master, I see," said Miles, "and it is not myself that will be afraid of a collection of brass. Why, I have fought in 40 battles in France and in Flanders, and never yet have I known fear. You are certainly a brave man, Miles, and that is why I have called you. The favor that I ask of you is this: will you watch here for me an hour or two while I get a little needed rest? You know that Brother Bungay has failed me these 5 nights, and I cannot keep awake longer. Is it to watch the house that you wish me? There is certainly nothing hard in that. I will hold my good cudgel in my hand, and keep my eyes on every door and window, so that no robbers will dare to come near. But it is the brazen head that I wish you to watch. Keep your eyes on it, and if it should begin to speak, then call me quickly. The brazen head, is it? Sure, and it cannot hurt me, for you have said so. But you will let me keep the cudgel in case the robbers might come, won't you?" "Oh, certainly, Miles." "Then trust me, master. Go and take your rest, and I will watch like a sentinel at his post." "I do trust you, Miles. Good night." And the weary friar went sleepily to his chamber and threw himself upon his bed. 4. The Watchman. Miles sat down close to the door with his cudgel in his hand. For a while he kept himself awake by looking about at the strange objects which his master used when carrying on his studies. They were not unknown to him, for he had seen them daily when serving the friar's meals. But now, in the dim light of the flickering lamp, they seemed to him like uncanny beings ready to pounce upon him and destroy him. He grasped his cudgel with a firmer grip and looked at the brazen head. The face of the image seemed to be beaming with a kindly smile, and Miles felt much braver. "The head cannot hurt me," he said to himself, "as so why should I fear those other things? No, no, I am not afraid." In the farthest corner upon his right was the carefully closed cask in which was stored the wonderful black powder that had so frightened the Oxford professors. Miles crossed himself when he saw it, and drew a little farther away. Then his eyes rested on a strange piece of glass, round like a wagon wheel, through which the friar sometimes looked when studying the stars. On a table close by were flasks of all sizes and shapes, crucibles for melting metals, and instruments whose use was known only to magicians. While Miles was lost in thought about these strange things, a slight noise caused him to look again at the brazen head. Its face still bore the smile that had braced his courage up, and grew bold enough to speak to it. "Ah, you head of brass," he said, "you are nothing but yellow material. You were made of the old kettles and sword hilts that I brought to my master. How foolish for any one to waste his time in watching you! How silly of my master to starve himself and me in order to buy brass for your making! A magician like him ought to know better. A snap of his fingers would bring us food and raiment fit for kings. But instead, he spends his time with you, and we have naught but scraps to eat and rags to wear. Come, Master Brassyhead, out with your secret, and let it be a recipe for my master to tell him how to get rich." Just as he spoke the last words, a bright flash as of lightning lit up the brazen face, and a low sound like muttering thunder filled the room. The mouth of the image opened. Its lips seemed to move, and in a voice scarcely louder than a whisper, it uttered the words, "Time is." Miles grasped his cudgel very hard and stood close by the door, ready to run, but as the image sat bolted fast to its pedestal and moved not, he soon grew very brave again. "Is that all you can say, old Brassyhead?" he asked. "Time is, did you say? Well, That would be fine news to carry to a scholar like Friar Bacon. You will have to tell a better secret than that before I waken him to hear it." Again the thunder rolled, and a brighter flash of lightning filled the room. Again the mouth opened, the lips moved, and a voice like the rattling of a brass kettle muttered, "Time was." Miles put one hand on the door latch and with the other shook the cudgel at the image. "Only to think," he said, "that my master and Friar Bungay should spend 7 years in making a head which can tell no other secret than that. Why, everybody knows that time was. Fie upon you for a brazen fraud, old brassy head! If you would only speak a little Hebrew or Latin, I should begin to think that you really have a secret to tell, and I should waken my master to hear it." Scarcely had he spoken when the room was lighted up with the brightness of day. The face of the image was no longer smiling, but it bore a dreadful frown. The floor swayed and trembled. The head appeared to lift itself from its pedestal, and in a voice of thunder it cried, "Time is past." Miles, in his great fright, fainted, and fell in a senseless heap by the door. There was a dreadful crash, a blinding cloud of smoke, and then all was still. Friar Bacon, roused by the noise, rushed into the room. The brazen head lay on the floor, shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Miles! Miles!" cried the distracted friar. The serving man slowly raised himself on his knees and groaned. "Did the head speak?" asked the master. "Tell me quickly." "Yes, master, he did speak," muttered Miles, shaking with terror. "But he said nothing worth remembering." "What did he say?" "Why, at first he said, 'Time is,' and as that is a secret which everybody knows, I urged him to say more. Presently he spoke up again and said, 'Time was,' and then, before I could run and call you, he roared out, 'Time is past,' and fell over against me with such a crash as to knock my senses out of me." "Oh, wretched fool!" cried Friar Bacon, angrily pushing the man from the room. "Leave my sight. Your foolishness has caused the wreck of all my hopes. The labor of 7 years is lost. Had I been awakened, I would have set machinery in motion to prevent this ruin, and the brazen head would have told me how to do most wonderful things. It would have told me how to build a wall around England and make her the strongest of all nations. It would have told me, but now all is lost. I will make no more experiments. I will burn my books. I will close my study. The rest of my life shall be spent, like that of any other monk, in the quiet cell of a monastery, and when I die, my poor name will be forgotten." End of chapter 14. Recording by John Smith.
Chapter 15 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Asaf Kos. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. As Rich as Croesus. Some thousands of years ago, there lived in Asia a king whose name was Croesus. The country over which he ruled was not very large, but its people were prosperous and famed for their wealth. Croesus himself was said to be the richest man in the world, and so well known is his name that to this day it is not uncommon to say of a very wealthy person that he is as rich as Croesus. King Croesus had everything that could make him happy: lands and houses and slaves, fine clothing to wear, and beautiful things to look at. He could not think of anything that he needed to make him more comfortable or contented. "I am the happiest man in the world," he said. It happened one summer that a great man from across the sea was traveling in Asia. The name of this man was Solon, and he was the lawmaker of Athens in Greece. He was noted for his wisdom, and centuries after his death, the highest praise that could be given to a learned man was to say, "He is as wise as Solon." Solon had heard of Croesus, and so one day he visited him in his beautiful palace. Croesus was now happier and prouder than ever before, for the wisest man in the world was his guest. He led Solon through his palace and showed him the grand rooms, the fine carpets, the soft couches, the rich furniture, the pictures, the books. Then he invited him out to see his gardens and his orchards and his stables. And he showed him thousands of rare and beautiful things that he had collected from all parts of the world. In the evening, as the wisest of men and the richest of men were dining together, the king said to his guest, "Tell me now, O Solon, who do you think is the happiest of all men?" He expected that Solon would say, "Croesus." The wise man was silent for a minute, and then he said, "I have in mind a poor man who once lived in Athens, and whose name was Tellus. He, I doubt not, is the happiest of all men." This was not the answer that Croesus wanted, but he hid his disappointment and asked, "Why do you think so?" "Because," answered his guest, "Tellus was an honest man who labored hard for many years to bring up his children and to give them a good education. And when they were grown and able to do for themselves, he joined the Athenian army and gave his life bravely in the defense of his country. Can you think of anyone who is more deserving of happiness?" "Perhaps not," answered Croesus, half choking with disappointment. "But who do you think ranks next to Tellus in happiness?" He was quite sure now that Solon would say, "Croesus." "I have in mind," said Solon, "two young men whom I knew in Greece. Their father died when they were mere children, and they were very poor, but they worked manfully to keep the house together and to support their mother, who was in feeble health. Year after year they toiled, nor thought of anything but their mother's comfort. When at length she died, they gave all their love to Athens, their native city, and nobly served her as long as they lived." Then Croesus was angry. "Why is it," he asked, "that you make me of no account, and think that my wealth and power are nothing? Why is it that you place these poor working people above the richest king in the world?" "O king," said Solon, "no man can say whether you are happy or not until you die, for no man knows what misfortunes may overtake you, or what misery may be yours in place of all this splendor." Many years after this, there arose in Asia a powerful king whose name was Cyrus. At the head of a great army he marched from one country to another, overthrowing many a kingdom and attaching it to his great empire of Babylon. King Croesus, with all his wealth, was not able to stand against this mighty warrior. He resisted as long as he could. Then his city was taken. His beautiful palace was burned. His orchards and gardens were destroyed. His treasures were carried away, and he himself was made prisoner. "The stubbornness of this man Croesus," said King Cyrus, "has caused us as much trouble and the loss of many good soldiers. Take him and make an example of him for other petty kings who may dare to stand in our way." Thereupon the soldiers seized Croesus and dragged him to the marketplace, handling him pretty roughly all the time. Then they built up a great pile of dry sticks and timber taken from the ruins of his once beautiful palace. When this was finished, they tied the unhappy king in the midst of it, and one ran for a torch to set it on fire. "Now we shall have a merry blaze," said the savage fellows. What good can all his wealth do him now? As poor Croesus, bruised and bleeding, lay upon the pyre, without a friend to soothe his misery, he thought of the words which Solon had spoken to him years before. No man can say whether you are happy or not until you die. And he moaned, "Oh, Solon, oh, Solon, Solon!" It so happened that Cyrus was riding by at that very moment, and heard his moans. "What does he say?" he asked of the soldiers. "He says, 'Solon, Solon, Solon,'" answered one. Then the king rode nearer and asked Croesus, "Why do you call on the name of Solon?" Croesus was silent at first, but after Cyrus had repeated his question kindly, he told all about Solon's visit at his palace and what he had said. The story affected Cyrus deeply. He thought of the words, "No man knows what misfortunes may overtake you, or what misery may be yours in place of all this splendor," and he wondered if some time he, too, would lose all his power and be helpless in the hands of his enemies. "After all," said he, "ought not men to be merciful and kind to those who are in distress? I will do to Croesus as I would have others do to me." And he caused Croesus to be given his freedom, and ever afterwards treated him as one of his most honored friends. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. The Gordian Knot. In the western part of Asia there is a rich and beautiful region which in olden times was called Phrygia. The people of that country were related to the Greeks, and they were well-to-do and happy. Those who lived in the mountains had mines of gold and quarries of fine marble. Those who dwelt in the valleys had fruitful vineyards and olive orchards. Those whose homes were among the hills kept great flocks of sheep, the wool from which was the best in the world. For a long time these simple-hearted people had no king. Every man was willing to do what he knew was the best for all, so there was no need of a ruler. But by and by, as they grew wiser, every man began to do that which he thought was best for himself alone. The gold diggers ate the grapes and olives of their neighbors in the valleys. The vine growers killed the sheep of the dwellers in the hills. The shepherds stole the gold which the mountaineers had dug from their mines. And then a miserable war began. And the land that had been so prosperous and happy was filled with distress and sorrow. There were still many wise and good men in the country, and these were much grieved at the sad state of affairs. "It would be better," said they, "if we had a king, as other people have. He would punish the doers of wrong, and would make laws for the good of all." But they could not choose a king among themselves. Each man claimed that he himself was the best fitted to be the ruler of the rest. And, had it not been for one of the wisest among them, they would have ended by fighting one another. "Since we do not know what to do," said this wise man, "let us ask the gods. Let us send to the oracle of Apollo and make our troubles known. Perhaps it will tell us what to do." All were pleased with this plan, and a messenger was sent to consult the oracle. The temple of Apollo was far across the sea, and many weeks passed before the messenger returned. Then all the best people from the mountains, the plains, and the hills met together near the chief town to hear what the oracle had told him. "The oracle did not tell me very much," said the messenger. "It merely repeated these two lines of poetry: 'In lowly wagon riding, see the king, who'll peace to your unhappy country bring.' I could not get another word from it." The people were much puzzled by this answer of the oracle. They could not understand it, and yet they felt sure that it meant something. While all were standing around the messenger, and wondering and talking, suddenly the loud creaking sound of wheels was heard. They looked, and saw a slow moving ox wagon creeping along the road. The wagon was loaded with hay, and on the hay sat a humble peasant with his wife and child. Everybody knew the peasant well. It was Gordius, the faithfulest working man in all that country. His poor little hut, with its vine-covered roof, could be seen half hidden among the trees at the foot of the hill. Suddenly, as the creaking wagon drew near, one of the wise men cried out, "In lowly wagon riding, see the king." And another completed the rhyme, "Who'll peace to our unhappy country bring." The people heard and understood. With a great shout they ran forward and greeted the bewildered peasant. They ran in front of his wagon. He was obliged to stop in the middle of the road. "Hail to our king!" said some, as they bowed down before him. "Long live the king of the Phrygians!" shouted others. "My friends, what does all this uproar mean?" asked Gordius, looking down from his high seat on the hay. "I pray you not to frighten my oxen with your noise." Then they told him what the oracle had said, and declared that he must be their king. "Well," he finally answered, "if the oracle has said that I'm your king I must be. But first let us do our duty to the great beings that have brought all this about." Then he drove straight on to the little temple of Jupiter that overlooked the town. He unyoked the oxen and led them into the temple. Just as people did in those days, he slew them before the altar and caught their blood in a great wooden bowl. Then, while he prayed, he poured the blood out as a thank offering to mighty Jupiter. "The wagon, too," said he, "will I give to the great being by whom kings are made and unmade." And he drew it into the inner part of the temple. Then he took the ox yoke and laid it across the end of the wagon pole, and fastened it there with a rope of bark. And so deftly did he tie the knot about the yoke that the ends of the rope were hidden, and no man could see how to undo it. Then he went about his duties as king. "I don't know much about this business," he said, "but I'll do my best." He ruled so wisely that there was no more trouble among the people. The laws which he made were so just that no man dared to disobey them. The land was blessed with peace and plenty from the mountains to the plains. All strangers who came to the temple of Jupiter were shown King Gordius's wagon, and they admired the skill with which he had fastened the yoke to the wagon pole. "Only a very great man could have tied such a knot as that," said some. "You have spoken truly," said the oracle of the temple, "but the man who shall untie it will be much greater." "How can that be?" asked the visitors. "Gordius is king only of the small country of Phrygia," was the answer, "but the man who undoes this wonderful work of his shall have the world for his kingdom." After that, a great many men came every year to see the Gordian knot. Princes and warriors from every land tried to untie it, but the ends of the rope remained hidden, and they could not even make a beginning of the task. Hundreds of years passed. King Gordius had been dead so long that people remembered him only as the man who tied the wonderful knot, and yet his wagon stood in the little temple of Jupiter, and the ox yoke was still fastened to the end of the pole. Then there came into Phrygia a young king from Macedonia, far across the sea. The name of this young king was Alexander. He had conquered all Greece. He had crossed over into Asia with a small army of chosen men, and had beaten the king of Persia in battle. The people of Phrygia had not the courage to oppose him. "Where is that wonderful Gordian knot?" he asked. They led him into the temple of Jupiter, and showed him the little wagon, with the yoke and wagon pole, just as Gordius had left it. "What was it that the oracle said about this knot?" he asked. "It is said that the man who should undo it would have the world for his kingdom." Alexander looked at the knot carefully. He could not find the ends of the rope, but what did that matter? He raised his sword, and, with one stroke, cut it into so many pieces that the yoke fell to the ground. "It is thus," said the young king, "that I cut all Gordian knots." And then he went on with his little army to conquer Asia. "The world is my kingdom," he said. End of chapter 16. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.
Chapter 17 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Hall. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Why Alexander Wept. Alexander, with his little army, overran all the western part of Asia. "The world is my kingdom," he said. He conquered Persia, which was then the greatest and richest country known. He burned the mighty city of Tyre. He made himself the master of Egypt. He built, near the mouth of the Nile River, a splendid new city, which he called after his own name, Alexandria. "What lies west of Egypt?" he asked. "Only the great desert," was the answer. "To the farthest bounds of the earth there is nothing but sand, sand, burning sand." So Alexander led his army back into Asia. He overran the country beyond the great river Euphrates. He crossed the grassy plains that lie along the shores of the Caspian Sea. He climbed the snowy mountains that seem to overlook the world. He gazed northward upon a desolate land. "What lies beyond?" he asked. "Only frozen marshes," was the answer. "Mile after mile, mile after mile, to the farthest bounds of the earth, there is nothing but fields of snow and seas of ice." So Alexander led his army back toward the south. He overran a large part of India. He subdued one rich city after another. At last he came to a mighty river called the Ganges. He would have crossed the river, but his soldiers would not follow him. "We go no farther," they said. "What lies to the east of this wonderful stream?" asked Alexander. "Only tangled forests," was the answer. "Mile after mile, mile after mile, to the farthest bounds of the earth, there is nothing else." So Alexander caused ships to be built. He launched them on another river called the Indus, and with his army floated down to the sea. "What lies farther on?" he asked. "Only trackless waters," was the answer. "Mile after mile, mile after mile, to the farthest bounds of the earth, there is nothing but the deep sea." "Truly, then," said Alexander, "all the inhabited world is mine. West, north, east, south. There is nothing more for me to conquer. But After all, how small a kingdom it is. Then he sat down and wept, because there were not other worlds for him to conquer. End chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. Chapter 18, King Richard and Blondel. Part 1, King Richard. King Richard the Lion-Hearted, with a great army of English knights and fighting men, went on a crusade to the Holy Land. The object of the crusade was to drive the Saracens out of Jerusalem, and make it safe for Christian pilgrims to visit the holy places in that city. Richard was a brave warrior. He was afraid of nothing, and no savage beast was more fond of fighting. Never was he more happy than when in battle, knocking the heads of his foes with his huge battle-axe, and shouting the Norman war cry, "God help us! God help us!" Many were his exploits in the Holy Land. His deeds of cruelty and of daring were such that even his name was a terror to the Saracens. But with all his rudeness and roughness and savage love of bloodshed, he was not wholly bad. Now and then he would act so kindly, or show such gentleness of heart, that men would forget his grievous faults. Much fierce fighting did the Crusaders find to do. The walls of Jerusalem were so well guarded by the Saracens that King Richard's men could find no way to get inside. They had to encamp on the barren hills outside, and wait for help to come. One morning Saladin, the noble leader of the Saracens, rode out of the city to see King Richard. The king went out from his camp to meet him, and each was so pleased with the other that soon they were fast friends. Later in the day Richard rode by the side of Saladin into the city. Through the narrow winding streets they passed, until they came at last to the Holy Sepulchre, where men said the body of the Saviour had been laid. There they shook hands and parted. Soon after this Richard made a truce with the Saracens. He promised to withdraw his army from the Holy Land, and it was agreed that there should be no more fighting until after 3 years, 3 months, 3 days, and 3 hours had passed by. With some of his bravest knights, King Richard embarked on a small ship and sailed for home. At first the sea was calm, and the wind wafted the king swiftly on his way. But after a few days a storm arose, the waves rolled mountain high, the ship was driven this way and that, until at last it was wrecked on an unknown shore. Most of the men who were with the king were drowned. It was as much as he could do to reach the land alive. He was bruised by the rocks, and choked by salt water, and chilled by the rushing wind. For the rocks and the water and the wind have no more respect for a king than for any other man. The country in which Richard found himself was wild and rough. Alone and quietly he made his way through woods and over mountains, not daring to tell who he was, for in those rude times no stranger was safe in a foreign land, and a shipwrecked king would have been a fine prize. So, as a poor pilgrim returning from the Holy Land, he trudged onward, looking very ragged and forlorn, and keeping out of the way of people as much as he could. Now and then he found food and lodging at the hut of some poor woodsman, but often he had no shelter under which to rest at night. He did not know how far it was to England, yet he kept going toward the northwest, and every day he felt that he was a little nearer home. He had traveled in this way for some time when he came to a more thickly settled country. There was a road, with now and then a field or a house by it. The few people he met looked at him in a way that he did not like, but he kept straight on and said nothing. One afternoon he came within sight of a strong castle with high towers and thick gray walls of rough stone. A little way from the castle there was a village of half a dozen houses, and at the entrance to the village there was a small inn. "Whose castle is that?" he asked of a boy who was driving some cows along the road. The boy stared at him as though he thought him mad, and then answered, "Why, everybody knows it's the Duke of Austria's castle." Now Richard had good reason for not wishing to see the Duke of Austria, but he could not well turn back, and he followed the boy and the cows down to the village. When they came to the inn, they went through a wide gateway into a courtyard where some knights were exercising their horses. As luck would have it, one of the knights was the Duke himself. He stared hard at Richard as he came trudging in behind the cows. "Hello, you fellow!" cried the Duke. "Who are you, and what do you want here?" "I am a poor woodcutter from the forest," answered Richard, "and I have come to offer you my services. There is no man in Austria who can handle an axe better than I." "Indeed," said the Duke, looking very keenly at his visitor. "I think I saw you wield an axe once. It was made of 20 pounds of English steel. I saw you wield it not among the trees, but against the heads of Saracens. Am I not right?" Richard knew that he was discovered. The Duke of Austria had seen him 100 times in the Holy Land, and would have known his face anywhere. "Yes, you are right," answered Richard. "As King of England I have often wielded such an axe, and I would fain wield it again when in the presence of the Duke of Austria." "Do you remember Ascalon?" asked the Duke. "I remember it well," said Richard, "and I remember the wall that I helped to build there with my own hands. I remember, too, the kick that I gave the Duke of Austria because he was too lazy to work on that same wall." "Very well," said the Duke. "You shall now have that kick back with interest." Then turning to his men he cried, "Ho, guards! Seize this fellow! Put him in chains and shut him up where the sunlight will never trouble him." Richard, with his back to the wall, made a strong fight for freedom, but what could he, with his bare hands, do against so many armed men? He was soon overpowered, and dragged away to the Duke's castle, where he was thrown into a dismal dungeon at the bottom of the tower. Part II. Blondel. For more than a year the English people heard no tidings of their king. They knew that he had started home from the Holy Land. They had heard, too, of his shipwreck, and it was rumored that he was held as a prisoner in some distant land, but nobody knew where that land was. Now Richard, in his happier days at home, had trained up a young rhymer or minstrel, whose name was Blondel de Nesle. Before going to the Holy Land he had spent many a pleasant hour in Blondel's company, listening to his beautiful songs. For the young minstrel had a rare, rich voice, full of the most charming melody, and no other singer in England or France could excel him. Sometimes Richard himself had composed little songs, which he and Blondel sang together, and a strong love, like that of two brothers, had sprung up between the minstrel and the king. Very sad was Blondel when no news could be heard of Richard. He wandered hither and thither about the king's lonely palace, and would not open his mouth to sing for anybody. At last he said, "I know that my master is a prisoner in a strange land. I will seek him. I will find him. I will save him." With his harp in his hand, he set out on his quest. He traveled through many lands in that part of Europe where he would be most likely to find his master. He made friends wherever he went, for in those days minstrels were welcome in every palace and in every hut, and Blondel's wonderful voice delighted all who heard it. One day he stopped at a little inn by the edge of a great forest. It was quite near to a strong castle, which was surrounded by high walls of rough gray stones. "Whose castle is that?" he asked of the innkeeper. "It belongs to the Duke of Austria," was the answer. "But the Duke has other and finer places, and it is now a year since he was last here. While he is away, the Count Tribable is master of the castle." Then Blondel inquired if there were any prisoners in the castle, for he asked that question in every place he visited. "Only one," answered the innkeeper. "He is kept in the dungeon at the bottom of the tower. I know not who he is. The Duke keeps a close watch upon him and feeds him well, and so I think he must be somebody." That evening Blondel sang before the Count Tribable and his family in the gray castle. All who heard him praised his fine voice and loved him for his gentle manners. They begged him to stay a while, for he had made the dreary old place merrier than it had been for many a day. The next morning Blondel wandered around to the great tower. He saw a slit in the wall, which he knew was the only means by which light was let into the dungeon below. He sat down on a block of stone and tuned his harp. Then he began to sing a song which he and King Richard had sung together in the old happy days before his master had gone crusading. "Your beauty, lady fair, all view with strange delight, but you've so cold an air, none love you as they might. Yet this I'm pleased to see, you love none more than me." This was the first half of the song, and when he had sung it he paused. Then far down in the dismal dungeon he heard the clear but mournful voice of King Richard singing the rest. "My heart you'll sorely wound, if ever you divide, and smile on all around, unwilling to decide. I'd rather hatred bear than love with others share." Blondel sprang to his feet, his heart filled with delight. "Oh, Richard! Oh, my king!" he cried in ecstasy. Then he hurried away to do what he could to secure his master's liberty. He went to the Emperor of Germany and to the King of France, and finally back to England, telling how Richard was cruelly kept in prison by the Duke of Austria. The King of France would have been glad to leave Richard in prison, for he was one of his bitterest foes. The Emperor of Germany was but little more friendly. Yet many of his knights and warriors said that it was a shame to treat the King of England so meanly. Then the French king accused Richard of having tried to poison him when both were crusading in the Holy Land. Upon this the emperor ordered that Richard should be brought out of his dungeon and made to plead his case before the High Court of Germany. He hoped in this way to get rid of the troublesome prisoner. Richard pleaded his case so well that many who heard him wept. Pale and weak from his long imprisonment, he told how the Duke of Austria had abused him. He showed how the French king had plotted to have him put to death. Then he spoke of the battles he had won in the Holy Land, shouting the war cry of "God help us! God help us!" The High Court had nothing to gain by declaring him guilty, and so it was decided that he should be set free on the payment of a large ransom to the emperor and the duke. It was Blondel and Queen Eleanor, Richard's mother, who helped to raise the ransom. With his harp and his fine voice, Blondel so wrought upon the feelings of the English people that they paid more willingly the price that was required of them. They gave the value of 1/4 of all the movable property that they owned, and we may well doubt whether any king was worth so much. Then Queen Eleanor herself carried the money to Germany and put it in the hands of the emperor and the duke. And when Richard the Lion-Hearted was at last a free man again in his own country, it was Blondel who first welcomed him back. End of Chapter 18. Recording by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio.
Chapter 19 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Karina Pereira. 30 More Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. King John and Prince Arthur. There was once a king of England whose name was John. He was a trifling, worthless fellow, and as mean a man as ever wore a crown. He was not the rightful king of England, for by the English law the crown ought to have gone to his nephew, Prince Arthur. But the prince was only a child, and in those rude, rough times the young and the weak had but little chance against the weak and the strong. It was an easy matter for John to push the lad aside, take possession of his castles and treasures, and then proclaim himself king. He allowed Arthur to go to Brittany in France, and there the little prince lived for some time in a castle which had been his mother's. John himself often went to France, for in those days a large part of that country was ruled by the English king. The French king, Philip, was very jealous of John, and there was nothing that he wanted so much as to drive him out of his possessions and take them for his own. But he was a great coward, and although he was always talking about making war upon King John, it was seldom that he found courage enough to do anything. One day, as he was thinking about the matter, it occurred to him that it would be a good plan to persuade Prince Arthur to help him. So he invited the boy to come and see him at Paris. "My dear young prince," he said, "how would you like to be king of England?" "I should like it above all things," answered the boy, "for indeed it is my right. Had not my uncle taken that which belongs to me, I should even now be wearing the English crown." "How many fighting men do you think you could muster in case of war?" was King Philip's next question. "From my own castle, perhaps 500, said Arthur. "Well then," said Philip, "it will be an easy thing for you to win back your kingdom of England. Only do as I say, and all will be well." And then he told the prince how he should arm his men and lead them out to fight against the soldiers of King John. "When the country people see that you are in earnest, they will all hasten to help you," said he. "Soon you will have a large army, and all your uncle's castles in France will fall before you. In the meanwhile, I will cross the English Channel with my French army, and will attack King John in his own country. He cannot withstand both of us. He will give up everything that he has taken from you, and then you shall be king of England." Prince Arthur was delighted with the plan, and he promised Philip that he would do what he could. But it is doubtful if he would have done anything had it not been for wicked men who wished to use him for their own selfish purposes. It was a proud day for Arthur when he rode out at the head of his little army and marched away to fight for the crown of which he had been so wrongfully deprived. It was a foolish undertaking, and hopeless from the start, and the men who were with the little prince ought to have told him so. But, no doubt, they had their own selfish ends to gain, and were willing that he should be deceived. He had never been happier than when he rode through the meadows that morning, the sunlight flashing from his bright armor, the tall grass rustling in the breeze, the birds singing by the roadside. Alas, he was never to be so happy again. The people did not join him on the road as he expected, and King Philip seemed to be in no hurry to send him help. But the little prince was brave and hopeful, and he led his army straight across the country to a small town where King John's mother was staying. "If you can capture the king's mother," said some of his advisers, "the king will give up everything for her sake." But he ought to have known that John had no such love as that for anybody. The town was easily captured by the prince's followers, but all the great people shut themselves up in the castle that stood close by, and dared their enemies to come near them. While Prince Arthur and his knights were besieging the castle and trying to find some way to get inside of it, King John himself came to the rescue with an army many times larger than the prince's. What could the prince do? Some of his men turned against him and went over to the king's army. With the rest he shut himself up in the town, and there, for several days, he defended himself like a young hero. But one night, when a dreadful storm was raging, a number of the king's soldiers climbed over the walls and got into the town. Before the alarm could be given, they were masters of the place. The prince was seized upon while he was in bed. Some of his knights were killed while trying to defend him. Others were made prisoners and afterwards thrown into dark dungeons, where they died. "Come to my arms, my dear nephew," said King John when Arthur was led before him. "Right glad I am to hold your hand again. You have played a lively game with your loving uncle, and your uncle will reward you as you deserve." And with that he sent the prince to the castle of Falaise, to be kept there until further orders. "I'll tell you what, Hubert," said he to his head officer, "that boy is the very bane of my life. I can do nothing, think of nothing, but that he is always in my way. Do you understand me, Hubert? You are his keeper." "Yes," said Hubert, "and I'll keep him so well that he shall never trouble you again." But Hubert was a gentle knight and had no intention of doing the boy any harm. He gave him the best room in the castle of Falaise and treated him as tenderly as though he were his own son. The prince, however, was very unhappy. He spent much of his time looking out of the narrow windows of his prison and wishing that he could once more see his dear old home in Brittany. The king had hoped that Hubert would find means to put Arthur to death, and when he learned that the lad was still alive, he was more troubled than before. He called some of his friends together, men who were as wicked and worthless as himself, and asked their advice. "What shall we do with that boy?" he asked. "He is the torment of my life. So long as he is alive, there will be men to plot and plan to make him king. How shall we be rid of him?" "Put his eyes out," said one. "Send someone with a dagger to visit him," said another. "Throw him into the river to be king of the fishes," said a third. King John liked the idea of the dagger. He told William de Bray, a Norman knight, that if he would stab the young prince, he should be richly rewarded with lands and gold. But Sir William turned on his heel and left the king, saying, "I am a gentleman and not a murderer." Then the king thought of putting out the boy's eyes. He found 2 ruffians who were willing to do the deed for pay, and sent them down to Falaise. They took with them the king's order, which they gave to Hubert. "You are commanded to burn the boy's eyes out with red-hot irons. See that you fail not. The man who carried this to you will do your bidding in the matter." Hubert read it and then showed it to the prince. "Arthur," he said, "I have a message from your uncle. I pray you look it over and tell me what you think of it." And then he turned away while the prince read. "Hubert," said Arthur. "Well, my prince, shall I tell you what I think of it? I think that you will not burn out my eyes. But the king commands, and I must obey. He will take my life if I refuse." "Then do it, dear Hubert, to save yourself. But how can you? These eyes never harmed you. They never so much as frowned upon you, nor never shall they. Is there no other way?" Hubert made no answer, but motioned to the ruffians to come in. They came, with the red-hot irons in their hands. The prince ran to Hubert and clasped him about the knees. "Oh, save me, Hubert! Save me!" he cried. "If it must be done, do it yourself. But send these men away. I promise that I will be very still. I will not flinch when the iron burns me. I will not cry out. But do it yourself, kind Hubert." The child's distress and terror were more than the tender-hearted Hubert could endure. He sent the ruffians away. "Give me the irons," he said. "I will do it myself." And they, to tell the truth, were glad enough to be off without doing the barbarous deed. Hubert led Arthur to another part of the castle, into a room that was seldom visited. "I would not harm your eyes for all the treasure that your uncle owns," he said, "but no one must know that I have saved you. The man must carry back false reports, and you must stay here in hiding. I have taken great risks in disobeying your uncle." When the ruffians went back to the king and said that his orders had been carried out, he was very much pleased. He felt sure now that the prince was out of the way and would give him no more trouble, and for a time all went well with him. At length Hubert was called away to fight in distant lands, and Arthur was left in the lonely castle, not daring to stir out or to show himself beyond the walls. One day a wicked tale-bearer, who had been entertained and fed at Falaise Castle, carried the news to the king that the prince was still alive and well. King John was furious. "Hubert shall die for this," he cried. Then he sent men to Falaise to find Arthur's hiding place. They carried the boy far away to one of the king's castles on the Seine River. There he was put in charge of a very cruel keeper. He was shut up in a narrow room above the river, where the only sounds to be heard were the lapping of the waves and the sighing of the wind. One night the prince was wakened from his sleep by his keeper, who told him that friends were waiting for him at the water gate. He hastened to dress himself and then followed the keeper down the narrow stairway to the door that opened out upon the river. The night was dark, and he wondered if Hubert had come to rescue him from his prison. He could see near the door the dim shadow of a boat with two men in it. They were muffled in long cloaks and were sitting very quietly. "Step into the boat," whispered the keeper. The prince obeyed and sat down in the stern. Then the man who held the oars pushed the boat off into the stream, and it was soon floating swiftly far away from the castle. "Is that you, Hubert?" whispered the prince to the man who sat in front of him. The man loosened his cloak and lifted his face. Then, as the moon peeped out from behind a cloud, Arthur saw that it was his uncle and that he held a dagger in his hand. In the morning, while the grey mists were still hanging above the river, King John and his boatmen were seen floating down the river towards the place where the king's army was encamped. But Prince Arthur was not in the boat, nor did any one ever see him again. End of chapter 19. Recording by Karina Pereira.
Chapter 20 of 30 More Famous Stories Retold. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Greg Giordano. 30 More Famous Stories Retold. by James Baldwin. King John and the Magna Carta. King John was so selfish and cruel that all the people in his kingdom both feared and hated him. One by one he lost the dominions in France, which the former kings of England had held. Men called him Lackland, because in the end he had neither lands nor castles that he could rightfully call his own. He robbed his people. He quarrelled with his knights and barons. He offended all good men. He formed a plan for making war against King Philip of France, and called upon his barons to join him. When some of them refused, he burned their castles and destroyed their fields. At last the barons met together at a place called St. Edmundsbury to talk about their grievances. "Why should we submit to be ruled by such a king?" said some of the boldest, but most of them were afraid to speak their minds. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was with them, and there was no bolder friend of liberty than he. He made a stirring speech that gave courage even to the most cowardly. "Are you men?" he said. "Why then do you submit to this false-hearted king? Stand up and declare your freedom. Refuse to be the slaves of this man. Demand the rights and privileges that belong to you as free men. Put this demand in writing, in the form of a great charter, and require the king to sign it. So shall it be to you and your children a safeguard forever against the injustice of unworthy rulers." The barons were astonished at the boldness of this speech. Some of them shrank back in fear, but the bravest among them showed by their looks and gestures that they were ready to make a bold stand for liberty. "Come forward!" cried Stephen Langton. "Come and swear that you will never rest until King John has given you the rights that are yours. Swear that you will have the charter from his hand, or that you will wage war upon him to the very death." Never before had Englishmen heard such a speech. The barons took the oath which Stephen Langton prescribed. Then they gathered their fighting men together and marched upon London. The cowardly king was frightened. "What do these men want?" he asked. They sent him word that they wanted their rights as Englishmen, and that they would never rest until he had given them a charter of liberties signed by his own hand. "Oh, well, if that is all, you shall surely have it," he said. But he put them off with one excuse and another. He sent a messenger to Rome to ask the Pope to help him. He tried, by fine promises, to persuade Stephen Langton to abandon the cause he had undertaken. But no one knew the falseness of his heart better than the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The people from all parts of the country now came and joined the army of the barons. Of all the knights in England, only 7 remained true to the king. The barons made out a list of their demands, and Stephen Langton carried it to the king. "These things we will have," they said, "and there shall be no peace until you grant them." Oh, how angry was King John! He raved like a wild beast. He clenched his fists. He stamped upon the floor, but he saw that he was helpless. At last he said that he would sign the charter at such time and place as the barons might name. "Let the time be the 15th of June," they said, "and let the place be Runnymede." Now Runnymede was a green meadow not far from the city of London, and thither the king went with his few followers. There he was met by the barons, with an army of determined men behind them. The charter which Stephen Langton and his friends had drawn up was spread out before the king. He was not a scholar, and so it was read to him, line by line. It was a promise that the people should not be oppressed, that the rights of the cities and boroughs should be respected, that no man should be imprisoned without a fair trial, that justice should not be delayed or denied to anyone. Pale with anger, the king signed the charter and then rode back to his castle at Windsor. As soon as he was in his own chamber, he began to rave like a madman. He rolled on the floor. He beat the air with his fists. He gnawed sticks and straws. He foamed at the mouth. He cursed the barons and the people for treating their king so badly. But he was helpless. The charter was signed, the Magna Carta, to which Englishmen still point as the first safeguard of their rights and liberties. As might have been expected, it was not long before John tried to break all his promises. The barons made war upon him, and never again did he see a peaceful day. His anger and anxiety caused him to fall into a fever, which nothing could cure. At last, despised and shunned as he deserved to be, he died. I doubt if there was an eye in England that wept for him. End of chapter 20. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.